Tucker Carlson's interview with Putin has over 140 million views on Twitter, 7 million on YouTube, and has probably been seen by over 200 million people across all platforms. The interview was over 2 hours long, and Putin spent the first 30 to 40 minutes discussing Russian history to explain the historical justification for Russia invading Ukraine, and went back over 1,000 years to exonerate Russia. If you look through the comments, you would think Putin is the smartest guy in the world. Just look how these people are gushing over his excellent knowledge of Russian history. The big problem? It's a lie. His history is complete Russian nationalistic and iridescent propaganda. He framed things in such a disingenuous way to make Russia seem like the victim to Poland and Austria throughout his explanation, and straight up lied or lied by omission numerous times. After seeing the shocking reception, especially by the supposed free thinkers, I decided to quickly debunk as much of it as I could without going too in-depth, so I'll try to keep the video relatively short. Before we get into the video, please leave a like and comment so more people can see the video and are not ensnared by the Russian falsities. Please correct anything you think I'm wrong about in the comments and add anything you think I missed. As the interview is so long, I'm obviously not going to be able to go over everything. The ultimate goal is to learn from history, so if I missed anything, do correct me. And if you like what you see throughout the video, please subscribe at the end. You need a brief historical background before we jump in to clarify many of the points I'm about to make. Unlike today, Europe for most of its history was not composed of solely or mostly ethnic states, where one group or people live in a nation. There are a few obvious exceptions today, with the Catalans in Spain or the Sorbians in Germany, but for the most part, European nations are relatively homogeneous now. The very idea of a nation-state first appeared not at the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, as is often repeated, but over 100 years later. While this may sound bizarre to many of you, nationalism only became a popular idea in the late 18th and early 19th century through the French Revolution, and it was spread throughout Europe by Napoleon. Nationalism, as we know it, did not exist throughout European medieval or Renaissance history. People were ruled by other ethnic groups all the time. Hungary had a Polish king, the Italians were ruled by Germanic emperors, the English were ruled by a combination of Danes, Normans, and Frenchmen, and Spain had an Austrian dynasty for over 150 years. I could go into more detail on the history of nationalism if you'd like, so comment if you want a video on that. Slavs were certainly no exception to the rest of Europe throughout the Middle Ages. A few terms must be established to understand East Slavic history, as they constantly appear and have been incorrectly used by Russian nationalists to falsely claim all Slavic history as Russian. The most obvious example are the Rus, who were a combination of Norsemen, East Slavs, and Finnic tribes to eventually form together into the Kievan Rus states, which lasted from the 9th to mid-13th century. This group are the ancestors for Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians. The following are all umbrella terms for Slavic populations. Ruthenian is a blanket term for any non-Russian East Slav. Ruthenia as a region was, and still is, extremely vague, being anywhere from Ruthenia proper, Ukraine, the old Kievan Rus people, or anywhere from the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea. It was essentially the medieval term for any East Slav, but was continued to be used up until the 20th century. Rusians are East Slavs native to the East Carpathian mountain regions in Central Europe, and they are predominantly Eastern Catholics. Roughly 250,000 Slovaks are Rusins, while 850,000 Rusins still live in Ukraine. They speak a unique language to Russians and Ukrainians and are a different people. Tatars are a combination group between Cumans, Goths, Mongols, and Turks that emerged from the Turkic steppe and migrated into Eastern Europe. Lastly, Cossacks are nomadic East Slavs who originate from the steppe lands and live in Ukraine and Russia today. Now, let's hear Putin's history of the Rus and Russia, and I will go through and add context and explain what he got wrong or lied about.
And it is considered to be the year of the establishment of the Russian state in 862, when the townspeople of Novgorod invited a Varangian prince, Rurik, from Scandinavia to reign. In 1862, Russia celebrated the 1000th anniversary of its statehood, and in Novgorod there is a memorial dedicated to the 1000th anniversary of the country.
The Russian state was not founded in 862 by Prince Rurik. Rurik was simply a Varangian chief who was invited to rule in Novgorod. Varangians were Vikings who went all throughout Europe and were by no means Slavic, so even Putin's incorrect founder of Russia was actually a Swede. Rurik did not begin the Kievan Rus, which was a medieval Ruthenian state. That was founded by Oleg the Wise, another Varangian, around 880, so his argument doesn't even hold up to scrutiny. It would be the same as France claiming to begin in 450 when Merovich founded the Merovingian dynasty, or in 751 when Pippin the Short started the Carolingian dynasty as the king of the Franks. While in actuality, France only began in either 843 with the splitting of the Carolingian Empire at the Treaty of Verdun, or with Hugh Capet succeeding in 987. Russia, at least in any recognizable form, was founded on January 16, 1547, when Ivan IV Vasilievich, better known as Ivan the Terrible, was crowned the Tsar and Grand Prince of all Russia. The oldest use of Russia was Rossiam, used first in the 1480s. Also, just because the Russian Tsars held a propagandized event in 1862 does not make it historically accurate. You must also think why the Tsars held such an event in 1862. At that time, Europe had erupted into nationalistic revolts that were determined to create new ethnically homogenous states. These damaged the Austrian Empire, and Russia saw it as such a great threat to their own empire that they brought their own army in to put down the nationalistic revolts for Austria. Ironically, the Millennium of Russia, the bronze monument in Novgorod that Putin brings up, with 129 famous people from Ruthenian history, does not include Ivan the Terrible, the actual first Russian Tsar, because he committed the massacre of Novgorod, where up to 60,000 people were brutally killed and the Orthodox Church inside the city was desecrated. Ivan imprisoned, humiliated, and tortured the archbishop, priests, and monks, and looted the St. Sophia Cathedral. Novgorod was sacked for 5 weeks, and the Muscovites destroyed Novgorod as a major Russian city. I mention all this to show the clear political machinations used by the Tsar by proclaiming 862 as the foundation of Russia. The Tsar simply wanted to prevent the turmoil that rocked France, Italy, Austria, Prussia, and the Ottomans from stirring up unrest similarly inside Russia.
From this time, the centralized Russian state began to strengthen. Why?
It was not a Russian state, it was a Rus state, which was also extremely disunited. This idea that the Rus were Russian is no different from an Italian arguing that ancient Rome was Italian, even though they spoke different languages and had different cultures. Just as the Romans were conquered by the Germanic Gothic peoples and culturally and demographically changed, the same would happen to the Rus later when the Mongols conquered them. Rus and Russians are not the same thing. This is another complete and blatant lie. The only place in all of Europe that had any unified centralized government in those days was the Byzantines or the Eastern Roman Empire with the theme system.
Why? Because of the single territory, integrated economic ties, one and the same language, and
the economies of the Kievan Rus were not integrated. It was all built along the Dnieper River, with many currencies used by the Kievan Rus. I'm not sure where he came up with this claim of one language. The languages in the Kievan Rus were not one and the same. Almost nowhere in Europe had the same language. Iberia, a much smaller region, had more than 10 languages commonly spoken throughout the peninsula in the Middle Ages. The Kievan Rus spoke mainly Old East Slavic, but Old Norse and a variety of Balto-Finnic languages were also commonly used. Old East Slavic was certainly not Russian, nor was it Ukrainian nor Belarusian. It would be like claiming that the Romans spoke Romanian or Romansh because they're both Romance languages. Modern Ukrainian and Russian both developed out of Old East Slavic, just as Romance languages developed out of Latin. This is why Ukrainian and Russian are still similar today, just as Portuguese and Spanish are similar.
the southern part of Russian lands, including Kiev, began to gradually gravitate towards another magnet, the center that was emerging in Europe.
I believe he is speaking of the 15th century here. These were not Russian lands, as Russia did not really exist yet, just as Italy and Spain did not yet exist. At that time, they were actually majority Turkic and ruled by the Mongols.
This was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. It was even called the Lithuanian-Russian Duchy, because Russians were a significant part of this population.
The Grand Duchy of Lithuania was never called the Lithuanian-Russian Duchy. What he's referring to is the name Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Russia, and Samogitia. The problem is that this was invented by Russian nationalists to try and make medieval Lithuania appear as a partially Russian state. The more accurate translation would be the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Ruthenia, not Russia, and Samogitia. Once again, Ruthenians and Russians are two different ethnic groups.
They spoke the Old Russian language and were Orthodox.
He is referring to Old East Slavic, which I mentioned earlier. Russian nationalists often call it Old Russian to claim all East Slavs are Russians, but this is false. Think of it as Latin is the Romance languages. Modern East Slavic languages developed from Old East Slavic, so Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, West Polesian, and Russian all branch from it, but none of these tongues are actually Old East Slavic. Calling it Old Russian is antiquated and inaccurate.
But then there was a unification, the union of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland.
Yes, the Union of Lublin on July 1st, 1569.
A few years later, another union was signed, but this time already in the religious sphere. Some of the Orthodox priests became subordinate to the Pope.
This is also true, the Union of Brest, which began in 1595. The irony is that the Catholic Church referred to those who were joining the church as Ruthenians, not as Russians, and the Decet Romanum Pontificem laid out the Ruthenian religious rites and practices that Poland had to respect.
During decades, the Poles were engaged in Polonization of this part of the population.
This was a standard practice at the time, and it was no different than the Russian colonization of Siberia, Karelia, Murmansk, or Moldova.
They introduced a language there, tried to entrench the idea that this population was not exactly Russians, that because they lived on the fringe, they were Ukrainians.
The first use of Ukrainian is in 1187 in the Kievan Chronicles. The chronicle referred to the Ruthenian people living in those lands as Narod Ukrainsky, the Ukrainian people.
Originally, the word Ukrainian meant that the person was living on the outskirts of the state, along the fringes, or was engaged in a border patrol service. It didn't mean any particular ethnic group.
These people were also known as Ruthenians. They were never called Russians, and that term did not develop until much later.
I repeat, demanding that they send them to rulers of Russian origin and Orthodox faith. When Warsaw did not answer them, and in fact rejected their demands, they turned to Moscow, so that Moscow took them away. So that you don't think that I'm inventing things, I'll give you these documents.
After mentioning the Union of Brest, I find it a bit ironic that he does not mention the fact that Vladislav IV Vasa, the Polish crown prince, was offered the Russian tsardom in 1610 by the 7 Russian boyars. He is talking about the Pereyaslav Agreement from the mid-17th century, but he's not accurately framing it. Led by Bohdan Khmelnytsky, who himself claimed to be the successor state to the Kievan Rus, the Khmelnytsky uprising was an uprising of Cossacks, not Russians. The Cossacks inside the Grand Duchy of Lithuania swore fealty to the Russian Tsar in exchange for greater autonomy, but they never said they were the same people as Russians. The Russians accepted it, but in the midst of this, the Swedes invaded Poland to instill their pretender to the Polish throne. Russia switched sides and aided Poland because Sweden was a greater threat. The Swedes were actually able to put a pretender into power and sacked Warsaw. Eventually, the Swedes were pushed out by the actual Polish king.
And 32 years later, I think, a peace treaty with Poland, which they called Eternal Peace, was signed.
The Treaty of Hadiak was proposed in 1658 and would have transformed the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth into the Polish-Lithuanian-Ruthenian Commonwealth. But it was never actualized despite being accepted. The Treaty of Perpetual Peace that Putin's talking about here and signed in 1686 that allegedly ended the conflict was disputed by the Poles and was not ratified in Poland until the Convocation Sejm in 1764, almost 100 years later.
Before World War I, Austrian General Staff relied on the ideas of Ukrainianization and started actively promoting the ideas of Ukraine and the Ukrainianization. Their motive was obvious. Just before World War I, they wanted to weaken the potential enemy and secure themselves favorable conditions in the border area.
Ruthenian nationalism was not fostered by the Austrians to prevent Russianization. The Ruthenian populations were in Austrian Galicia, also known as Austrian Poland. These were lands Austria gained from the first partition of Poland in 1772. Austria actively promoted Ruthenians to counterbalance the old Polish nobility that had ruled the area, effectively trying to separate the Ruthenians from the Poles, not from Russians. The ironism here, as previously mentioned, is that Putin disregards that Russia aided Austria, the people who were supposedly harming Russian speakers inside Austria and convincing them they were Ruthenians. When Franz Ferdinand asked for Russian aid, the Tsar, the emperor and autocrat of all the Russians, Nicholas I, garnered up to 200,000 men and helped crush the Hungarians, aiding Austria. Russia easily could have demanded concessions in Galicia for the supposed Russians living there, but that never happened, because Russia knew the Ruthenians and Poles living there were not any more Russian than the Croats or Slovenes on the other side of the Austrian Empire.
In 1921, peace with Poland was proclaimed, and under that treaty, the right bank of Dnieper River once again was given back to Poland.
He quickly brushes over the Soviet-Polish War that lasted from 1918 to 1921, when the Soviets reached as far as Warsaw and looked poised to invade all of Europe, until the Poles miraculously defeated the Soviets and drove them back. I'm not sure what he meant here regarding the right bank of the Dnieper. Poland did not get close to the river in the Treaty of Riga, but that could be a translation issue. It's also a good time to mention that Poland was by no means flawless or blameless during the interwar period. After the collapse of the German, Austrian, and Russian empires, all the minority populations that were within these empires revolted and began fighting themselves as well as their original overlords for historical claims of land. Poland wanted to create the Międzymorze, or the Intermarium, a new form of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This led them to conflict with most of their neighbors, including Ukraine. The Polish-Ukrainian Wars were fought from November 1918 to July 1919. Despite fighting against Ukraine, Pilsudski, the Polish leader, actively supported an independent Ukraine, saying in 1920, "There can be no independent Poland without an independent Ukraine," at the Treaty of Warsaw. He knew Poland would fall without Ukraine, saying before he passed, "My life is lost. I failed to create, free from the Russians, Ukraine." So, while Poland was as guilty as Ukraine, Slovakia, or Romania for fighting to incorporate their ethnic lands, it was not the aim of Poland to have ideological wars like the Soviets.
He did collaborate with Hitler, you know? Hitler offered Poland peace and a treaty of friendship. An alliance demanding in return that Poland give back to Germany the so-called Danzig corridor, which connected the bulk of Germany with East Prussia and Königsberg.
It is ironic he brought up East Prussia and Königsberg because it was later colonized by the Soviets. All the Germans were kicked out by the Russians, and the region was Russianized, so according to his logic, that would somehow give Germany justification to invade the region, even though today there's no Germans living there. The USSR later offered it to Lithuania for administrative purposes and to further increase the Russian population and Russify Lithuania as another form of colonization, but they rejected that.
After World War I, this territory was transferred to Poland, and instead of Danzig, a city of Gdansk emerged.
Gdansk was the original city name. Mieszko I of Poland founded the town in the 980s. It was controlled on and off by the Teutonic Order, Prussia, and Poland for hundreds of years, and was not named Danzig until it was Germanized in 1309, 300 years after the city was founded. So I'm not sure what Putin is talking about, that Poland somehow created Gdansk after World War II.
Hitler asked them to give it amicably, but they refused. Still, they collaborated with Hitler and engaged together in the partitioning of Czechoslovakia.
Poland did not coordinate the integration of Założa with Germany. The Czechoslovak-Polish border conflict had been going on since the Czechoslovak-Polish War in 1918. Poland did not collaborate. They took advantage of the weakened state to secure their control of Założa to prevent Germany from taking the Polish region that happened to be part of Czechoslovakia. The only agreement between Poland and Germany was the 1934 German-Polish Declaration of Non-Aggression, in which both agreed to recognize each other's borders and have peace for 10 years, and which the Germans later broke when they allied with the Russians and invaded.
By the way, the USSR, I have read some archived documents, behaved very honestly. It asked Poland's permission to transit its troops through the Polish territory to help Czechoslovakia.
The Soviets had been aggressive to all Eastern European states and fought wars against Poland, Finland, and Ukraine. It is ridiculous to expect Poland to allow a hostile army into their nation to defend another hostile nation. The Russians also threatened Poland on September 22nd to cancel the Polish-Soviet non-aggression pact they had signed in 1932 if they did not allow them to march a 330,000-strong army through Poland into Czechoslovakia, but Putin conveniently omits this. Had Poland allowed the Soviet army in, the Soviets would have conquered Poland. You have to simply look at what happened to Latvia and the other Baltic states, where they allowed the Soviets in, and their democratically elected governments were quickly toppled by Bolshevik puppet regimes.
As under the well-known Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Part of the territory, including western Ukraine, was to be given to Russia. Thus, Russia, which was then named the USSR, regained its historical lands.
He casually mentions the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact for returning Ukrainian lands to Russia, but disregards the main part of the treaty, carving up Poland between Russia and Germany. The Russians and Germans mobilized a combined 2 million men to invade Poland. It was a brutal invasion that saw 70,000 Poles killed, 132,000 injured, and around 700,000 Poles captured, as both sides brutally repressed the Polish people. Both wanted to eradicate the Polish culture and people and to destroy the very idea of Poland from the globe. There were many atrocities perpetuated by the Soviets and the Germans that I cannot speak about on YouTube, but I'm sure you know what I'm discussing. The Germans formed the General Governorate for the occupied Polish region. It was completely governed by Germans because Poles refused to collaborate with the Germans, as they were considered stateless, with the ultimate goal by the Germans to eradicate them and replace them with German colonists. The situation on the Russian side was no better, as Polish lands were forced under the Belarusian and Ukrainian Soviet Socialist republics, with Poles being horribly mistreated.
As for Poland, it received, apparently in compensation, the lands which had originally been German. The eastern parts of Germany, these are now western lands of Poland.
This is a complete rewriting of history on Putin's part. It was Russia who forced the Poles out of their ethnic eastern lands and into German lands. Poland didn't want most of the lands they got from Germany. Their only claim was to part of southern Silesia, where there was a large Polish population, and they fought Germany for them in the interwar period. Poland did not have a claim on Pomerania at all, hence they never fought over it with Germany. The Soviets forced Eastern Poles west to resettle because the USSR wanted to expand, and they knew the US and the UK would not allow Poland to be directly ruled by Moscow, as Ukraine was. Lviv, Vilnius, and Daugavpils were all historical Polish cities. Most of the Polish majority were ethnically cleansed by the OUNB during World War II, the OUNB being the German collaborators in Ukraine. The best Polish claim to Pomerania would have been the beginning of the 11th century with the Principality of Poland under the Piast dynasty, but Poland never pressed claims for these lands as there was no ethnic or really historical claim at that point.
Stalin insisted that those republics be included in the USSR as autonomous entities. For some inexplicable reason, Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, insisted that they be entitled to withdraw from the USSR. And again, for some unknown reasons, he transferred to that newly established Soviet Republic of Ukraine some of the lands together with people living there, even though those lands had never been called Ukraine.
This is false, as the Ukrainian or Ruthenian identity existed far before this, as previously discussed. Lenin forced through the term that they had the right to leave the Union, but if he believes that Lenin did not add this, Ukraine somehow would have never wanted to leave, which would be absurd. The Bolsheviks envisioned communism would spread throughout the entire globe, known as the World Revolution. Putin also doesn't mention Stalin and his mass murders of the kulaks in Ukraine. Ukraine existed far before this and was created after Lenin gave permission for the creation of the National Soviets.
After the World War II, Ukraine received, in addition to the lands that had belonged to Poland before the war, part of the lands that had previously belonged to Hungary and Romania. So Romania and Hungary had some of their lands taken away and given to the Soviet Ukraine, and they still remain part of Ukraine. So in this sense, we have every reason to affirm that Ukraine is an artificial state that was shaped at Stalin's will.
Do you believe Hungary has a right to take its land back from Ukraine, and that other nations have a right to go back?
There were, and still are, a tiny amount of Hungarians in modern-day Ukraine. The lands that Hungary lost to Ukraine had already been lost before World War II at the Treaty of Trianon in 1920. The Hungarians lost the lands they gained for working with the Germans during World War II. Also, the Hungarians rebelled in 1956 from the USSR due to Soviet policies, including because of their form of Russification. It's not mentioned in this, but in 1989, the Russians essentially held Hungarians for ransom for Soviet investment, and they demanded that they pay Russia to remove the troops when they were occupying Hungary.
First, I think that then Russian leadership believed that the fundamentals of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine were, in fact, a common language. More than 90% of the population there spoke Russian. Family ties. Every third person there had some kind of family or friendship ties. Common culture, common history, finally, common faith, coexistence with a single state for centuries, and deeply interconnected economies.
The 1897 Russian census shows that most provinces of Ukraine had 40 to 90% Ukrainian speakers as their primary language, with over 22 million native Ukrainian speakers, so this is another lie by omission by Putin.
Russia even agreed voluntarily and proactively to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and believed that
the Soviet Union was already collapsing after the August coup. Whether or not Russia agreed to the collapse of the USSR, it was already done. So claiming it was proactively collapsing and that they somehow could have avoided it is absolutely absurd.
Denazification. After gaining independence, Ukraine began to search, as some Western analysts say, its identity. And it came up with nothing better than to build this identity upon some false heroes who collaborated with Hitler.
The OUN was by no means good. They did collaborate with the Germans and committed many heinous acts.
I have already said that in the early 19th century, when the theorists of independence and sovereignty of Ukraine appeared, they assumed that an independent Ukraine should have very good relations with Russia.
There was not a giant conspiracy to invent a fake identity known as Ukrainian, though that's an absurd idea.
But due to the historical development, those territories were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Poland, where Ukrainians were persecuted and treated quite brutally as well, as were subject to cruel behavior.
Putin, unsurprisingly, doesn't mention that everyone who wasn't a noble was treated poorly. The actual Polish citizens were treated slightly better, but not well. But it's also not like the Russians were treating people well. Nobles believed they had the divine right to rule over people all throughout Europe, and despite how bad the treatment of commoners was in the Commonwealth, it was arguably still better than serfdom in Russia at the time.
There were also attempts to destroy their identity.
Despite the alleged attempts to destroy these identities by the Poles, all of these peoples, Poles, Lithuanians, Ruthenians, Catholic and Orthodox priests, they all worked together in the January uprising in 1831 to try and shove off Russian rule. They all despised the Russian cruelty and tyranny and wanted to revive the full Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth borders.
Other countries fight against them. But Ukraine is not the case. These people have been made into national heroes in Ukraine. Monuments to those people have been erected. They are displayed on flags. Their names are shouted by crowds that walk with torches, as it was in Nazi Germany.
I fail to see how this is any different from Russia having statues of Lenin or Stalin or Soviet flags. This imagery is still common throughout Russia, and it is equally horrid to the Poles, Ukrainians, and every other ethnicity under the USSR. Do not forget, Stalin was responsible for deliberately killing around 6 million people, with over 9 million deaths that were foreseeable. The Holodomor killed 10% of Ukraine's population, as 3.5 million people perished. Any references were considered anti-Soviet and only became possible to discuss in the 1980s under Gorbachev.
I say that Ukrainians are part of the one Russian people.
This is the all-Russian nation, 19th century iridescent Russian propaganda to claim all East Slavs should be ruled by Russia. Just because you have a similar culture and speak a similar language does not mean you're the same people. The Swiss are a prime example of that, being composed mainly of French, German, and Italians, but that does not mean it should be split up between France, Germany, and Italy. Spain and Portugal should not become one nation because they speak a similar language and share a peninsula, nor should Germany try to annex Austria because they both speak German. Additionally, Germany and Austria are culturally and linguistically closer to one another than Russia and Ukraine, and last time they tried to unite, things didn't go so well for Europe.
They say, no, we are a separate people. Okay, fine. If they consider themselves a separate people, they have the right to do so, but not on the basis of Nazism.
I don't know if that's the basis for Ukrainian nationalism, but if it is, you should ask yourself why the USSR didn't eliminate it from the decades when they ruled Ukraine.
The threat I think you're referring to is a Russian invasion of Poland, Latvia, expansionist behavior. Can you imagine a scenario where you sent Russian troops to Poland?
Only in one case, if Poland attacks Russia. Why? Because we have no interest in Poland, Latvia, or anywhere else. Why would we do that? We simply don't have any interest. It's just threat-mongering.
Obviously, Putin has not committed the number of atrocities that the German leadership did in World War II, but his reasoning here is eerily similar to Germany's following the annexation of the Sudetenland on September 26, 1938. The Sudetenland was the last territorial demand I have to make in Europe. Germany told Great Britain. I've assured him further that, and this I repeat here before you, once this issue has been resolved, there will no longer be any further territorial problems for Germany and Europe. I do not know what Putin really wants for Poland or Eastern Europe, nor do I really support either side, but I just wanted to point this last thing out to everybody. I know this is different from most of my videos, but if you want to see more political content like this, please like, share, and subscribe. Comment any historical or political video ideas you guys have, and if you want to support me, please check out my Patreon or become a channel member. Goodbye.